Hello, welcome to Liberty Lounge. I'm Max Stenner, and here is my co-host Samuel Turner.
Hello.
Our guest for today is Rod Liddle, who is a journalist and an associate editor of The Spectator. He is the former editor of the Radio 4 Today programme, has presented television programmes and written books, and he currently writes for The Sunday Times, The Spectator, and The Sun. Now, onwards with the interview. Sam, you have our first question.
Yeah. Oh, well, firstly, Rod, thank you very much for coming on. It's
pleasure, mate.
It's a big pleasure.
Comrade.
So I think the big story in the news has been Ireland complaining about illegal immigration from the United Kingdom, and they want to send asylum seekers back to the UK. Should the UK pursue some sort of returns agreement with the EU?
It's incredible. I've just written about this for The Spectator. I was trying to work out what made me more delighted, the birth of my daughter or Ireland getting itself into a paddy over immigrants coming into their country. And I couldn't really work it out because I've just been in a state of hysteria, gleeful hysteria for the last 3 days, really. Should we pursue a returns policy with the EU? I think probably not. I think we should probably just let the Irish stew for a bit, and meanwhile set up a processing centre for refugees in somewhere like Crossmaglen, with a shuttle bus to the border with kind of refreshments, a pepperoni or something for everyone who goes. It is such a wonderful demonstration of woke ideology, of progressive ideology, liberal ideology, of the grandstanding, the virtue signalling, all those cliches suddenly coming up against reality. And so we've had Ireland, which has been probably the most pro-immigrant, pro-migrant of any of the EU's countries, largely because none of them can get there. Because, of course, crossing the Channel 19 miles to Dover is tricky, but it is nothing as to trying to navigate the Irish Sea. And therefore they don't do it, of course. And whilst they've had some migration, it's been on a kind of, a bit like Scotland, a minuscule level. They haven't had any of note. And now suddenly they are getting them. It gives the lie to a whole bunch of things. The first of which is that clearly Rwanda is a deterrent. Otherwise, we know that now from both the asylum seekers who are trying to get into Ireland and indeed from the Irish government itself. And we have this half-wit, Simon Harris, suddenly stamping around and deciding that what Ireland really wants with the UK is a closed border, which is the first we've heard of that. It is magnificent, a magnificent demonstration of what happens when liberal ideology comes up against reality, and it has cheered me up more than I can properly express, guys.
Thanks. Yeah, but it's caused a bit of controversy because, of course, Ireland wants to send migrants back to the UK, but we are not allowed to send migrants.
No,
back to
I
France.
know. Tell them to get stuffed. Just say no. Sorry.
Why don't we just send them to France?
Yeah.
Well, why can't we send them to France is obviously the answer. Yeah. And the Irish say, oh, no, but we have this agreement, which, of course, they won't give any details of because they know it is about as legally binding as your agreement with your local drug dealer. It has no binding. This was signed in 2020, apparently, if it was signed at all. There is a treaty with Ireland about returns, but it has no binding force so far as anyone is aware. And in any case, morally, what supersedes it is the issue of the EU and its quite clear spite towards the United Kingdom in the years since Brexit, which has meant it will cooperate with us on nothing and will do its damnedest to humiliate us on whatever subjects it can. Here you have it right back in their court. What Ireland should be doing is petitioning the EU, and particularly our allies and friends in France, to say, well, actually the Brits have got a bit of a point. Why on earth should they take our returns from here if the EU generally won't take any returning people from Britain? But I think that's an intellectual equation too complex for the Irish to follow.
Yeah, and Labour have said that they want a returns agreement with the EU where we can send illegal migrants back to the EU if they came from there, and then we'll accept some from them. But do you think that would? Do you think there's any hope of that? Do you think it would work, or is it just pie in the sky thinking?
Well, if there's a returns agreement, and we can send people back to France, then it's kind of problem over, in a sense, and it's problem over for us. It's problem over for the Irish. But I don't think that's going to happen. And the trouble with Labour's approach is that almost everything it's done is predicated upon a kind of fantasy land. So what they're going to do is they're going to sort out the criminal gangs. Well, how are you going to do that? Do you think we're not trying to do that at the moment? And once you've sorted out those criminal gangs, do you not think other criminal gangs will pop up, to fill the demand to get across the channel? I mean, everything that Yvette Cooper, bless her, ever says is predicated on a nonsense, on a fallacy. I didn't have much time for the whole Rwanda idea, largely because I think it would be much better if we processed the immigrants, the illegal immigrants, in a territory which was at least nominally under British control, because then you obviate the need to go to war with the inevitable legions of lawyers. They kind of get cut out of the picture because we're not sending them to Rwanda, which is, of course, the other wonderful, beautiful irony of the Irish situation, which is that they passed a law which they're now trying to re-rat on, saying that they couldn't send any migrants to Britain because, of course, Brother Prussia, that Britain isn't a safe place for asylum seekers because we might send them to Rwanda. Well, they're quickly changing their mind on that. It is wonderful. What a magnificent example. It so happens so rarely when a story pops up and you can suddenly say, told you so. And say, told you so to the Irish, told you so to the EU, told you so to those who say Rwanda isn't a deterrent, told you so to the Labour Party. It's a no-lose in my book.
Yeah, I agree. It is quite entertaining, especially since the Irish elite were calling anti-immigration protesters far right, full extremists.
Well, deal with your own far-right protesters in Waterford and various other places in Ireland where suddenly the Irish, with their absolute pygmy influx of immigrants, are getting very, very annoyed indeed, as everyone else in Europe is, which is why we have have social democrat governments popping up all over the place, from Slovakia, Sweden, I've forgotten where else. And somewhere else just voted SDP. I can't remember who it was.
Denmark.
Denmark. So we're having more and more voters thinking this is a failed experiment. Merkel and everyone since has got it wrong. We want this to stop. We want to preserve our existence. It is the right of every European person to preserve their existence and to believe that the government might help them in that objective. But that is not being done by the Liberals. It just isn't being done.
Thanks. Yeah, and Max, did you have any thoughts on this, or do you have another question regarding?
I'd like to introduce the next question. This is something that you have written about and is also becoming an SDP policy. Should we ban smartphones for under 16s?
Yes. Yes, unquestionably, in my book. The scientific and medical and psychological evidence is so profound that had we thought about this before, the problem was upon us, we wouldn't possibly have agreed to it. The deleterious effects upon kids is enormous. There is on the one side of it the cognitive problems associated with the short attention span demanded by smartphones to the degree that they can't work, can't think, can't concentrate. We know all about that through the hate report and various other reports. We also know about the way in which the social media can have a terrible impact upon the mental health of kids under the age of 16, and indeed the access to violence and pornography. There is no question. I mean, if we'd thought about this in advance, we wouldn't have allowed it. It's just that in retrospect, it seems a very difficult thing to do, but it's not that difficult. I mean, I would like to see it. I think we need a bit of social stigma about this as well, because, of course, most of the reasons that kids have smartphones is for the convenience of their parents. It's not for the benefit of the kids. And I think we need a bit of stigma associated with this so that it becomes almost as obscene to see a 9-year-old kid with a smartphone or a 10-year-old kid with a smartphone as it would be to see him with a cigarette. It is extremely damaging. The people I talk to about it, and I'm part of a group which is working quite hard to advance this cause. Sorry, my dog's doing something weird. Jess, stop it. Sorry. I'm interested in the ideology of this. I can understand why the libertarians, those guys that spiked online, and some of the backbench Tories don't like it because they're for, libertarianism, which is fair enough. What I don't get is why the left, well, I do get it to a degree, is the left not going along with this. A friend of mine, one of my good friends in journalism is Johan Harry, who has written a brilliant book about loss of focus occasioned by smartphones. Now, Johan is on the far left. That's the only possible way you could describe him, is green far left. And and indeed, most of his animus is turned upon the smartphone companies. But nonetheless, he thinks we shouldn't have smartphones for kids. And similarly, there's the intelligent centre with traditional core values, people like Miriam Cates and so on, who understand that it is a family's duty to protect its kids and a government's duty. So, but it's still something which the left won't go along with. Sorry, Max, go on.
My question to you would be,
Hello?
What about this can't be solved by just banning social media?
So I'm not hearing you very well, Max. I'm not hearing you very well, mate.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, intermittently. Yeah, go on.
What about this smartphone ban that can't be solved by just banning social media for under 16s?
I don't know how you would do that. And there would be so many ways in which the kids would get around that in any case. The safest thing to do, it's rather like telling them that they're allowed to smoke, but they're not allowed to inhale. It's the Bill Clinton approach to the situation. I just don't see the point of it. It seems to be perfectly reasonable. We don't let kids drive until they're 18. My own opinion actually is that we should have that should be later, and a whole bunch of things later. So there's plenty of precedence for saying that here's something which you can do once you're an adult. It's not something you can do once you're a kid. It seems to be reasonable.
What I'd say is that my stance is that we shouldn't chop down the entire tree. We should cut down the rotten branches.
No, but the rotten branch is the smartphone. It's
the rotten branch.
Whether it's social media or anything else, it's still associated with an extraordinary reduction in concentration time. It takes up an extraordinary amount of a kid's day being on that phone. I do not see how you can ban social media, because there will always be ways around that. There will always be an escape route, and the companies are very, very clever. And so what does it mean? You mean they can just go on Google? I just don't get how that would work in practice. Whereas simply saying, yeah, you can have a smartphone on your 18th birthday or your 16th birthday, whatever you think is right. I just don't. I think you would be so happier as young people if you were freed from that tyranny.
Yeah.
I would.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say quickly. I think that is a good point, and I think I do agree that people would be happier if they put down their smartphones, especially children, teenagers. But the real question is, like, should it be the government mandating it, or should it be parents taking more responsibility for their kids? But Max,
well, yeah, sure. Good questions. It should be both. I think the government does have a duty. It has a duty to protect its most vulnerable citizens, and I think we should agree that kids are the most vulnerable citizens. It has abrogated that duty in relation to so many things, whether it be divorce, marriage, stuff like that. That has really had a bad impact upon the happiness and mental well-being of children. And of course, the growth of the post reality transgender movement. All of these things have been allowed to flourish in our schools and amongst young people, and it's made them less happy. It would seem to be, if you believe the statistics. Yeah, I think parents do have a great role, and I think there is a tension between what you insist that the state must legislate on and what you would suggest the parents should do. But if you do that, the problem will be that it will be the very poorest of the kids who continue to have the greatest impact from social media coming through smartphones. It will be the poorest. So, in fact, if you tried to cut the government out from it and said this is down to parents, you'd have the middle class parents doing what they're supposed to do, and you'd have some of the working class parents who are very time poor, and sometimes poor as well as time poor, perhaps not being as rigorous because they cannot be. Sorry, Max.
What I'd say is you make a good point, but most of the negative effects of smartphones are derived from social media. Because without the social media, they can use the internet to research things. They can do homework, because a lot of homework is set to do on smartphones.
No, it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be, Max.
They can research things so much easier. They can contact their friends.
Yes, it shouldn't be easier. It shouldn't be easier.
There's the social media that has the negative
This
impact.
is part of the problem, Max, that things are made too easy and kids aren't given that space in order to think. Things are too close at the tip of a finger, and it makes it far, far too easy. This is one of the ancillary problems with smartphones.
But it's like that for everyone.
Yeah, of course it is. Of course it is. It's like for journalists. I mean, tell me about it. If you're Owen Jones, or you just go to the Owen Jones scrapbook, tap a thing, and you copy and paste. But that difficulty thing you mentioned is one of the problems which you would obviate if you ban smartphones. The problem is I don't see it as being just social media, because basically the internet is social media. Yes. There isn't much on it which isn't. I would agree with kids having brick phones, so that their parents can find out where they are, and so that the kids can text each other and email and ring each other. I don't see a great problem with that, but it's the access to the internet that's a problem.
Yeah.
What I'd say in return to that, so this is something I'm very about, is that if it's like that for everyone, then why shouldn't we ban phones for everyone and not just under
Because
16?
children aren't everyone, Max. Children aren't everyone. Children are vulnerable. Their brains don't develop properly until they're 25 or 45 in the case of Owen Jones. But their brains are not developed. This is why countries such as Scotland have a rule that people under the age of 25 cannot be held fully culpable for crimes which they commit. You know, there is not a full understanding or maturity of how to make important decisions, of what the ramifications of those decisions are. And this is something which we're seeing, of course, repeated in the transgender argument, which is that, you could say the same thing for them. Why should we ban puberty blockers for, well, not puberty blockers, but why should we ban invasive surgery for kids under the age of 18, but not ban it for people over the age of 18? Because you cannot possibly at the age of 14 or 15, or I would argue even 16, have the full understanding of what's going on. It doesn't mean you're a twat. It doesn't mean you are a lesser person. It's just a subject of biology every bit as much as is the immutability of sex. It is a biological fact, and that's why we call kids children. And I think what we've done in the last 30 to 40 years has been supremely negligent towards kids. We've made a number of decisions on public policy and social policy which have, without question, had a deleterious effect upon the mental health and indeed happiness of children, and that's had ramifications into how they go on when they reach the age of maturity. And we've done so because we think it's forward thinking, and it gives a lot of latitude to parents and so on. But it ignores the dangers which lurk there whenever we do that, and that's true of so many things we've done with regard to people under the age of 18. The other thing is voting, of course. You may or may not think it a remarkable thing that the Scottish National Party, for example, thinks that people should be able to vote at the age of 14, but should not be guilty of crimes, culpable for crimes, until they're 25, because they don't have the ability within their brains to make up the decision about what is right and what is wrong. And so you have this bizarre idea that they can choose the government, but cannot be guilty of crimes. We have to kind of line this stuff up scientifically. We have to understand that children are children. That teachers shouldn't attempt to be children's mates, their students' mates. They are there to inculcate, they are there to teach, they are there to edify, etc. And that there is a gap between the two. We're not all equal, and that's the other problem.
Thanks, Rod. Speaking of Scotland, for listeners who don't know, Humza Yousaf has recently resigned as First Minister this week after his coalition with the Scottish Greens collapsed due to them giving up on their quite ambitious net zero target. The question for Rod is there hope that Scotland might finally have a decent government?
No, I don't think so. One wishes it would. I think the problem is that given the failure of independence, the independence movement in Scotland, it's a bit like UKIP and Brexit. It cuts away at the at the raison d'etre for the Scottish National Party. And so what it decided to do was to go the whole caboodle and become a progressive left-wing group, and go into a partnership with the Greens, and to place upon the heads of the Scottish people some absurd legislation which the Scottish people simply didn't want, and that was there in the Transgender Act particularly, but also in the various Green pledges which the Scottish National Party reneged upon a couple of weeks ago. And it's always the same. It's a total mistake. I mean, the great allure of the Scottish National Party was that it gave Scottish people a sense of identity, belonging, and nationalism, which was often posited against England, sure, but it was nonetheless genuine. It was a genuine wish to say, this is who we are, this is what we believe in. Once the independent campaigns had failed, however, the SNP didn't really know what to do, and so it went to the far left. I don't see it getting much better if Jim Swinney is the leader. I don't see the position for Scottish people getting much better if Labour takes all those seats which the SNP will inevitably lose in the next general election. So it is a difficult. It's a difficult time for them, and Scotland is in a pretty parlous state. Its health services is in ruins. Its education service isn't much better. There's enormous amounts of debt, and the excuse that somehow we south of the border, and I'm sitting here only about 12 miles from the border, that we're all to blame, is an absurdity, and I think the Scottish people are beginning to understand that. But no, I doubt very much that the SNP will suddenly reform itself and become a competent party. Sorry.
No, yeah, I think that's it's quite a pessimistic view, but not unrealistic. And Max and I are both sort of a bit sceptical of devolution, and probably one of the best arguments against devolution is the SNP and how it allows them to blame Westminster for all the bad things that happen in Scotland, but then they
everything on the left has become about a hierarchy of imagined victimhoods, and the suggestion that we down here are somehow to blame for whatever iniquities happen in Scotland is obviously an absurdity. That being said, even though I very much hope Scotland remains within the Union, I don't go along with quite a lot of people on the right who say it would be a basket case if it became independent. I don't think it would. I don't see any reason why it would be any worse off than Ireland, which is one of the richest countries in the world. I think it would be perfectly competent, perfectly able to do what it wants to do. But that, in a way, isn't the point, because the Scots, for good reason, don't really want to go down that route. A majority, and it would seem to be a growing majority, don't want independence.
Yes, and I mean, well, I've heard the view that if Scotland, if they left the UK, the EU wouldn't want to accept them because they have the oldest, the unhealthiest, the population in Europe, the most debt. But yeah, I don't see things improving much for the Scottish people either, whether it's under the SNP or Labour. Max, what's your view on this? Do you have a take on this?
I personally think that Scottish nationalism is going to go down in the next election. I think that the SNP have really screwed up. I think they are in nearly as much of a dire situation as the Conservative Party. They're going to lose a lot of seats to Labour. I personally like Kate Forbes, but she's never going to get in.
Well, no, she's now said she's not standing, Max.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're left with Jim Swinney, just mayor of Toy Town, basically. I mean, I like Kate Forbes as well, but I no, there's nothing particularly which. I mean, it was obviously it was great fun to see Hamza Yousaf defenestrated. That was great. But what comes next? I mean, I think the SNP is, for an awful lot of Scottish voters, discredited beyond all belief, both with the legislation they've tried to introduce recently, the collapse of the coalition, but also with the very serious police inquiries into wee cranky in a camper van. So, the trouble is that the votes would seem to go to Labour. That may not be entirely the case. Don't forget that the SNP was historically a centre-rightish party, apart from independence. It was a blue-nosed Protestant party. And it was a Labour Party in Scotland, which was a Catholic party and appealed to, the Gorbals and various parts of Glasgow, and Jimmy Reid and all those, a communist, obviously. But I think those days are gone. I think it's changed its shape completely.
Yeah, but do you think the SDP might have a chance picking up some votes there, considering most Scots, I'd say, are probably centre-left, but then socially moderate?
Everyone is economically to the left a little, and socially to the right a bit. We have the entire country within our grasp, but no one knows who the fuck we are, mate. That's the problem.
No, yeah, you're right. And Max, did you have another question regarding this, or another topic?
The next question I was going to ask is related to Russia. Do you think the UK and other democracies are doing enough to contain and sanction Russia in its war against Ukraine?
I think historically we haven't. I think there is something shady and immoral in kind of sponsoring a war and not putting your neck on the line, which is what we've been doing for 2 years. That's not to say that I think we should become involved immediately in a war with Russia. It's just that it makes me feel very uneasy that we might be prolonging the war and therefore prolonging the deaths of people without actually getting our own noses dirty, I find that a problem. I think we have appeased Russia, and I speak as a Russophile in a way, having always been. But I think we have appeased Putin too much in the past. We appeased him over Georgia. We appeased him over Crimea. And that does have, I loathe historical comparisons, but that does have the whiff of the 30s about it, that continual appeasing and hoping it would simply go away, or that Putin wasn't serious. By the same token, we've also meddled dangerously in Ukrainian policies, particularly the European Union, Baroness Ashton, if that's her name, that ghastly wife of Peter Kellner. We undoubtedly meddled in their elections. I don't think any of that justifies Putin's decision to invade. I mean, that is the thing which we need to remember. But we also probably need to remember that Crimea, the Donbass, and Luhansk, probably, if you held a vote tomorrow, if there was some way of doing a free and fair vote, would tend towards the Russian side, certainly by a mile in Crimea and rather less so in Luhansk and Donetsk. And so somehow we've got to sort this out. We have to pinpoint Putin as a war criminal and a tyrant, which he undoubtedly is, at the same time as recognizing the legitimate aspirations of people in what is a considerably expanded Ukraine as to what it was, who do not wish to be in Ukraine. So it's a very, very difficult issue. And it may be that on those issues of independence for Luhansk, Donetsk, Crimea, that we're unable to get to some sort of solution in the end, but only, I suspect, if Putin is no longer there.
Thanks, Rod. Yeah, just to add a bit of context, we added this question because of a couple of news stories, or stories that have been in the news recently. Like the US has recently accused Russia of deploying chemical weapons as a method of war, and also you had the story in Germany where you've had politicians being accused of supporting Kremlin-funded propaganda, and Chinese spies in Germany and the UK as well. And I just wanted to know your view on this, considering it seems like we are kind of just allowing this kind of hybrid warfare to happen.
Well, I think there are a number of things in there. Firstly, the allegations of chemical warfare. The US means CS gas. Now, with the best will in the world, it's all about. Derrida would have enjoyed this discussion, I think. It's all about what we call things, and I suppose CS gas is a chemical weapon, but it's not a terribly dangerous chemical weapon. I mean, I think we've got to be a bit circumspect when we bandy these terms around. I know the Russians aren't circumspect. I know that Putin's propagandists threaten us with nuclear annihilation every few minutes on television. But there's a gap between what the Russians say and what the Russians actually do. The other point is one which I've been banging on about for ages, which is I just hope we're doing the same things to China and Russia that they're doing to us. I just hope that our security services, our intelligence services are across all this and are doing as much as is being done to us. I have no evidence to show that they are or that they're not. But obviously we need to do that. And the most basic thing of all, we need to up our defence spending. This is an increasingly dangerous world. It is no use whatsoever, Rishi Sunak saying we've suddenly realised that this is a dangerous world, we're going to spend a bit more on defence, when you've been cutting defence for the last 10 years, which is what they've done. We are no longer in those glorious halcyon years of 92, 93, when the Soviet Union dissolved and there was an amenable drunkard in charge of what remained of it, and the states were fissioning off in all directions. We are now in a position where there's a resurgent Russia, a very nationalistic and arguably fascistic Russia, which I think, has its old 1,000-year-old paranoia about the West, which has always been accompanied by a hankering to be like the West, but is also determined to take back some of the ground that was ceded effectively, implicitly, by Gorbachev at the turn of the 90s. And it remains to be seen as to whether Putin believes that Moldova, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, etc., are part of that plan. I genuinely don't know. My guess is he probably does mean it about Moldova.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I suppose it seems though like that fighting against Russia and fighting against an enemy like Hamas as well. It's kind of like fighting an enemy with one hand tied behind your back, because they can do things to you or to the West that we can't do to them without compromising our principles. But it also
except I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure you've quite got the morality right. For me, the biggest issue on the morality business is that we are prolonging this war without really getting ourselves involved in it, which I think is kind of awful. And I know that there are some NATO strategists who believe that this has been a very cannily played operation by NATO. But I'm not sure that it's a terribly moral operation that's been played by NATO. as more and more Ukrainians and more Russian conscripts die. It's a very, very difficult issue. I mean, I think the sooner we come to a resolution which doesn't humiliate Russia but humiliates Putin, that's the important thing. If there was some way of getting towards that scenario, that we don't humiliate Russia, we don't penalize those people in Ukraine who wish for to be part of a Russian state, but we do make it clear that Putin and the way he's behaved will not be tolerated. At the moment, that seems a very, very long way away.
Thanks. Yeah, and yeah, you do make a correct point that we're not as willing to get involved as Russia is. But one thing that worries me slightly about this kind of new Cold War situation we've got with Russia and China is that it seems like, on Ukraine at least, Russia cares more. It seems like they care more about Ukraine. They're willing to fight for longer. They have more patience. They have more fortitude. And so do you think that if we are in a new Cold War, some people would say it is, some would say it's not, do you think there's a risk that the West might end up losing because it doesn't have the fortitude, it doesn't have the self-belief that other powers like China and Iran and Russia do?
Yes, I think that's true. I think we've been suffocated by democracy and affluence. And of course, we like both of those things, democracy and affluence, and we wouldn't want to give them up. But nonetheless, they have a draining effect upon the nation. You know, I don't know how many people of your age, you guys, if you ask them, would say, would you go and fight for the West in Ukraine or in Moldova or in Estonia? I think you'd have a thinnish take-up. I think we've become softened, and that is a natural process in a democracy. Democracy does soften people, which we saw, you know, when Hitler came to power in Germany. You know, he was able to take advantage of that softening and effectively grab the levers of power with the imprimatur of the German people in the end. It's very, very difficult. It's a difficult line to tread. And I'm not sure that we've treaded the way it should have been done. I think you're basically right that I don't think there is an appetite over here for war. I think it needs to be brought home to people a little bit more sharply as to what happens if you don't stand up to tyrants.
Yeah, indeed. I think that is the case. Yeah, we just got one final question that Max is going to ask, and then we'll wrap up with some final thoughts, maybe.
My final question to you is, what should be done about the anti-Israel protests on American and British university campuses?
I thought it was going to be about Taylor Swift. I'm sorry, I had myself prepared for a moment there, and it wasn't.
Sorry to disappoint.
I don't know. I don't know enough about it, to be honest. I don't know enough about what's happening in this country, and America is a law unto itself. I mean, my own view on British universities is that at least 1/3 of them should be closed down, and that we need an education secretary who is prepared to take stentorian action to ensure that that all views are acceptable and are allowed to be expressed and should not provoke little petty fits of tantrums by those who disagree with them. And you see, this is what's behind the whole thing, which is that the kids in America, that's the Kim Wilde song, by the way, the kids in America...
I know who Kim Wilde is.
Yeah, we're the kids in America, whoa, oh. Good song.
Seen her live.
Yeah, well, I've interviewed her, and it was embarrassing. I was drooling. Down now, I was 19 at the time. It's one of our biggest problems. One of our biggest problems is what we do about universities. So, for example, getting rid of stupid fucking subjects which are conning young people into taking up, and which will never ever enable them to repay the debts which they've incurred for society. So that is one side of it. The other side of it, of course, is the monoculture which pertains in universities, which I suspect doesn't pertain in universities, but which seems to pertain in universities, particularly, I ought to add, amongst the academic staff rather than the pupils. Because the kids who turn up at universities are only 16 when they get there. Their opinions are not fully formed. When I was 16, I was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. I knew fuck all. And kids of 16 basically know fuck all. They may care very much. They may be better informed than many people who are 70 years old. But basically, given the length of time they've been on this planet, they don't know enough. But for this monoculture to have persisted by the academicians and the people who run the universities is, I think, a disgrace. It devalues British university education, and it leads to the kind of horrendous sort of monothink which we have on campuses, which is that Hamas, the freedom fighters, terribly lovely, liberal, nice people, perhaps naughty little squirrels on occasion, but nonetheless, they're in the moral right, and a complete
Quiz for Palestine.
Pardon?
Quiz for Palestine.
Queers for Palestine, yeah. Queers for Palestine almost answers every question that the left ever raises. It is that reality versus illusion. And I despair of the universities at the moment, absolutely despair of them. And so increasingly do the students from first world countries. We don't get as many. We get the third world coming here under the illusion that we still run good universities. I would rather go to the University of Accra than pretty much any British university at the moment. So it's a huge problem, and the problem is the monocultural, the complete lack of diversity of thought in our universities. When I studied a left-wing subject, sociology, at university, and that was at the London School of Economics, which was a radical university, of course. I was taught by a Marxist. I was taught by a sociobiologist. I was taught by a very famous post-Weberian who was basically a liberal. I was taught from all sides, I got the Talcott Parsons. He wasn't sort of swept away because he was an imperialist or a racist. I got to hear all of it. And I got to hear modern feminist thought from Shulamith Firestone and people like that. It was a bazaar of different opinions and ideologies, and all the better for that. You don't get that anymore. You just don't get it anymore. And I think that is the great disgrace of our university system.
Cheers. Yeah, I think that's definitely true. There needs to be more diversity of thought. And I think there is a kind of monoculture among the young who are very quick to end friendships with people who hold different views. But just very finally, what issue do you think is not receiving? I mean, we've covered a lot of ground in this interview, but what one issue would you say has not received enough attention, in your opinion?
Well, there's lots of them which appeal to me viscerally. Most of them environmental, I have to say, which sounds a bit odd coming from a social democrat, but it's nonetheless the case. I think the destruction of just very quickly, I think the destruction of the number of animal species which live on our planet, is something which we will long regret and should feel guilty about, in the same way that we feel guilty about slavery. But it's such a side issue at the moment, even if climate change is in there. It's such a side issue. I mean, the stuff which I think will appeal in the next election to voters, and which they think isn't given enough attention, is immigration, migration, and probably the woke stuff. And the left doesn't believe in the woke stuff. Well, the sensible people on the left don't. Oh, yeah, Owen Jones obviously does, but he's a twat, he's thick. The real left doesn't believe in it. Now, I'll tell you how you can tell that when you say to them, but what about the idea of, very heavily bearded men competing and winning against women in women's sports? And they say, yeah, well, that's bad. But it doesn't matter to the electorate. It's about the economy. As soon as they say it doesn't matter, it really, really does, and that they don't believe in it. And so I think wokery does matter. I think whenever I've been out campaigning for the SDP, I've always done exactly as Will and the bosses have told me to do. And I've said, here's our manifesto. We want to increase housing, which I don't actually agree with as it happens, but there we are. We want to increase housing. We want investment in the north. We want to, yes, etc. And everyone looks at me and says, well, yeah, whatever. But as soon as I say to them, we also believe that women don't have cocks. As soon as I say that to them, they say, oh, thank God, will you be saying that? And yeah, of course we will be saying it. So that there's that, and then there's migration. And I let myself down, and I let the Social Democratic Party down recently when I was on Question Time, BBC Question Time. Partly because I kind of dozed off. I was so fucking bored. But there was a emetic tirade of puke from Tim Farron about how these people were all human beings. And this was reflected by the audience. They said, they're all human beings. And what I should have done was go to war with this vacuous, self-serving, grandstanding shit, which you will hear every night on the BBC and every day in your morning papers. We know they are human beings. I'm glad you've just realized they are. We know they are. That's why there's a problem. Because we need to deal with this situation humanely. But once you've said they are human beings, where does that leave you? We need to sort out. You can, if you wish, have a total open borders policy. I can see the logic of that. I think it would be disastrous. I think it would be the end of Western civilization. And I think Western civilization has been a force for good rather than anything else. But if you just emote about the issue, and if it simply becomes associated with racism, that if you are anti-immigrant, you are racist. And my objection to immigration during the Brexit debate was that it undercut British people's wages. So it was a socialist argument. Then you are nowhere. And I think most people in Britain, a good 50 to 60%, are worried about immigration. And they are rightly worried about immigration, and rightly worried about what it will mean to us in terms of our economy, but also in terms of our culture. And I think the more strident we become on that, the more we risk being labelled cunts by, the various mainstream media, BBC type people. But the more we will connect with ordinary people.
Rod Liddle, thank you very much for coming on. It's been an absolute
Thank you, Sam.
pleasure.
Thank you for coming on, Rod.
Thank you, Max.